Whose lives get priority before, during, and after a disaster? When climate-induced disasters such as wildfires or heatwaves strike, they don't affect everyone equally. Every aspect of a disaster, including vulnerabilities, preparedness, response, and recovery, is to some extent a social calculus. Systemic racism, cultural norms regarding U.S. citizenship, and assumptions about who is considered a worthy disaster victim often blinds policymakers and disaster relief organizations to the unique needs of undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Because undocumented migrants fall outside these norms, they often are treated as less than human or even disposable. These conditions directly shape disaster response and climate adaptation policies. For undocumented migrant farm workers in particular, the promise of a better life often collides with the harsh realities of systemic inequalities. Undocumented migrants are struggling to survive in a region of wealth and prosperity, and they are the invisible populations living and working behind the bougainvillea curtain. This idiom references the fast-growing evergreen vine with an explosive magenta color adorning the gates of mansions and vineyards for added privacy. For example, in recent fires, the economic impact of smoke taint is estimated to have cost the California wine industry over $3.7 billion. Smoke taint occurs when smoke and ash permeate the skin of grapes, which can affect the taste and smell of wine, making it unsellable. However, too much concern is often placed on the economic impacts to the wine industry, but not on the farm workers that are harvesting grapes during wildfire events and how their lungs are also being tainted. They are not provided with adequate occupational health and safety protections, let alone hazard pay or federal disaster funds to work in mandatory evacuation zones considered hazardous to the general population. Making these inequalities visible is important because in California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, and of course the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequalities, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, disasters such as wildfires in California are not isolated events. They often now compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. So now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of disaster impacts on undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants.
Think about all these things all the time because I think it's one of those things, and part of like I was saying, a big picture or like planning. It's like, okay, we had COVID, the pandemic, but what could be next, and how do we prepare for that? Right here in Sonoma County, we've had fire season. Thankfully, this year we have had no fires and it's been raining, which we're all so appreciative of. But also understanding that there could be another disaster, and how do we have a plan to jump into action? How do we make sure that we have our team ready to go and they feel supported and like emotionally ready to jump into emergency work again? And then also making sure that we're aware of like the areas where we still need to grow or we need to improve as an organization, as a team, to be able to reach more community members.
Our research illustrates the urgent need to recenter disaster policy and recovery efforts to include the most marginalized and stigmatized populations. One of the largest gaps in safeguarding communities from disasters is the federal exclusion of undocumented people from receiving disaster aid. Millions of Californians are undocumented, and disproportionately high numbers of them work in sectors that are severely affected by wildfires and other climate-induced disasters. Their families are especially vulnerable to disasters due to the lack of language access to emergency warnings, minimal economic resources to evacuate and rebuild homes, and lower rates of healthcare and home insurance coverage. In response, migrant organizations, community organizers, and coalitions have come together to address the problems faced by undocumented communities. With the lack of federal, state, and local support, they responded to a humanitarian crisis affecting some of California's most impoverished people by raising funds and providing direct disaster services. In particular, the needs of Indigenous migrant workers and their families are often overlooked by government officials. California has hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people from Mexico and Central America living and working in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops, cut flowers, and winemaking. Indigenous Mixtec, Tuki, Maya, and Chatino people are not Hispanic or Latino, though they are often grouped with Hispanic communities. Many are illiterate and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native languages. This impedes their ability to obtain health care, housing, and education, to negotiate with employers to improve their work situation, and to exercise their basic civil rights. Climate-induced disasters are exacerbating these pre-existing inequalities.
I think what's unique about 805 and DocuFund and some orgs or some initiatives like ours is that we realize that because we're serving a community that's excluded from receiving other funding, traditional like government funding, I would say that the fundraising model is complete. It's just very different from other disaster response organizations because it serves a community that because of a legal status is considered less deserving of being helped when disaster hits.
It was there was a red flag warning, which means that the air is really it's really dry, it's really hot, there's wind, and if there's going to be a fire, then it's probably going to spread, and it'll be bad. And so, but it was during the harvest, and so workers were going out and working. And a worker called me in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. and said that they didn't feel safe working. There was lightning striking, it was raining, and they were worried. But they were being told by their mayordomo, the supervisor, that they had to work. And so I drove out there. She asked me to come, and I drove out there. But by the time I got there, the worker had raised the concerns with the mayordomo, and the mayordomo had just, and her concerns were not just about herself, but actually about other workers. And there were older women who were working there, and she was really worried about their health. But the response from the mayordomo was to yell at them and to cuss them out and tell them that if they didn't want to work, they could go home, or they should go home. And so they were all sent home by the time I got there. And I think that was already the second shift that night that those workers had been working, because people were working 2 and 3 shifts, and leaving their kids home alone to do that. And I think that it's important to think about these kind of stories, because this is how in reality people's lives are impacted by the climate crisis. But it's really because of the choices that wealthier people, that employers are making, because it doesn't have to be that way. But the climate crisis pushes it, and then because of the inequality that exists, and especially the racialized inequality, then it plays out in that way.
In September of 2022, the first California Undocumented Summit was held in Santa Rosa to bring organizations and community partners together to learn about the efforts that they implemented to enhance disaster policies and services to undocumented migrant communities. Participants highlighted how migrant-serving organizations had few dollars, N95 respirator masks, mental health services, and other resources to meet the urgent needs of undocumented people who lined up for disaster clinics in need of help. These organizations argued more inclusive disaster planning must integrate the needs and concerns of undocumented communities long before a disaster strikes. Such planning should focus on 3 key areas. First, policymakers must legitimize migrant community knowledge and experience and consider how they conceptualize who is considered a worthy disaster victim or recipient of disaster aid. Second, governments need to involve migrant communities in actual disaster planning, response, and recovery. Ahead of a disaster, governments need to build strong relationships with trusted community groups to ensure that they include the sensitive populations in their disaster planning and policies. Third, stronger worker health and safety policies are needed. There is uneven N95 respirator mask implementation and enforcement, a lack of a requirement for emergency plans for employers that are pressuring workers to labor in mandatory evacuation zones, and subpar air quality monitoring are all areas that need improvement. Finally, governments need more diverse disaster leadership. Current leadership in all levels of government does not represent the diversity of the United States, and in particular lacks the experiences of the people who are often hardest hit by climate-induced disasters. Senior level appointees and managers are overwhelmingly white and male. If society truly wants to tackle disaster risk reduction, it begins with the social integration of marginalized populations, including undocumented migrants, before a disaster strikes. Including them in the social safety net for disaster aid, healthcare, hazard pay, unemployment assistance, and other social capabilities allows everyone to be full, thriving members of society before, during, and after a major disaster.